Welcome, everyone. I'll take questions of clarification as I'm going along, so do jump in if it's not clear what I'm presenting, but we'll leave a bit of time at the end for a discussion as well of the issues. Okay, so I'll start off. So Ron has given a bit of background about what we're looking at. So we're looking at 3 different workers' compensation programs here, and we have cohorts from each of these 3 programs. There are different programs from different time periods over the history of workers' compensation in Ontario, and I'll give you a bit of background about each of those programs and how they differed. So we're going to jump right into it. A little bit of overview of the motivation of why we're looking at this issue and comparing these 3 different programs. Some of you may know there's been dramatic decreases in the number of days on benefits per lost time claim in most recent time periods. So if we look over the data from 1990s through to most recent time period, days on benefits has been increasing on average for lost time claims. In particular, there's an increase in a very long duration lost time claims. So at the upper end of the scale, so people who are off for long periods of time, those days on benefits are increasing for that cohort in particular. In contrast, what we're seeing, as you probably also know, that there's been a decline in claims rates over that same time period. If you look at data, over the 1990s through to most recently, there's been a dramatic decrease in the number of claims being made per full-time equivalent in Ontario. This is a trend that's happening in other jurisdictions as well, so it's not specifically to Ontario. Also increasing the proportion of healthcare-only claims relative to lost time claims, so that the mix of claims is changing as well. So there's more no lost time claims relative to lost time claims that are occurring over this time period. So lots of different dynamics happening in this time period that we want to better understand what's driving some of these factors. In particular, in our case, we're looking to see how it's being driven by programmatic changes. So there's some concern that work disability as measured by days on benefits may be driven by programmatic or legislative factors. And so that's what we're exploring in this study, seeing how these different people fare under these different programs. If we can, as best we can, control for all of those other factors that are happening in the economy, in industry, in terms of exposures and safety practices and things of that sort. This is something many of you have seen. I borrowed it from Sheila. She's laughing there because she's used it a lot too. You're probably getting tired of seeing this. This comes from the Ontario Service Safety Alliance, newsletter or report, the annual report, where they've documented that phenomenon within the set of companies that they serve. So there, lost time injuries that are decreasing, whereas days on benefits have been increasing at the same time. So these trends that are going in opposite direction, and they were just highlighting that fact within the sector of companies in the service sector that they have as clients. Previous research has provided some hypotheses. Not all of them have been confirmed, but obviously there may be multiple things happening that are driving these trends. Some suggestions that maybe injured worker characteristics are changing. The demographics, as we know, the labor force is aging, so that might be a factor that's driving some of these things. More women in the labor force as well. Claim severity might be changing, increases in severity of claims, particularly for some types of exposures possibly. Changes in work environment and new challenges for return to work. So business practices have changed, a lot of contracting out, short-term jobs and things of that sort. So accommodation might be a difficult thing. Policy change as well is the key thing that we're looking at. So the recent policy and operational practices under the most recent Bill 99, which was introduced in 1998 and is still in effect today to varying degrees, some of those practices. And so that might be one of the factors as well. And that's the one that we are really trying to focus on in this study. And Sheila has done some work in this area as well. So the IWH long duration claims study, I'm not sure if I've given it the right name, but Sheila's done some work and has found that policy and practices have, to some degree, an explanation of why we see some of these changes happening in Ontario, obviously, in that case. Some of these phenomena are characteristics that are larger, macroeconomic, Canadian, developed country, global kind of phenomena. Others are more specific to our jurisdiction. So the study objectives of this particular study is to investigate labor market earnings recovery of workers' compensation claimants with permanent impairment. So I'm focusing specifically on individuals whose claim their injury resulted in a permanent impairment. Not all claims that are lost time, but just those that are permanent impairments. And they're from 3 different benefits programs in Ontario. We wanted to determine whether there's evidence of programmatic impact on the success of reintegration into the labor market. And also we're trying to develop some methods for evaluating earnings recovery of injured workers following work injury. So we're doing some, well, I think it's a bit innovative methodological approaches that I'll give a bit of detail. For those of you who are really techies and want to know all the stats background, you can come talk to me afterwards. I'm not going to challenge you all with the statistical approaches that we're using, but we're doing something that's not commonly used and trying to push the margin in terms of statistical analyses as well. So what's new and different about this study from other studies that I've indirectly referenced that have been thinking about these issues? So we're focusing on injured workers just with permanent impairments, as I mentioned. We're using a database that has almost 3 decades of information, which allows us to evaluate these 3 different programs. So we have this database that we're looking at, and I'll give a bit more details about it, starts in 1982, and they keep adding new years as it becomes available, so it goes up to most recent time periods. There's a large number of individuals in this database who are not workers' compensation claimants. This is a database that has 20% of Canadian tax filers in it, so it's quite large. It's about 5 million individuals in this database. So we can select very strong comparators or controls to help identify, how injured workers may be different from their concurrent cohort of individuals who are maybe doing the same kind of work, making the same kind of earnings, but are not claimants of workers' compensation. The long follow-up in this database, because it follows people indefinitely until they die, actually, if you're in the database. We can look at 10 plus years of labor market earnings for each of the individuals that we're looking at who are workers' compensation claimants, so that we can see this long follow-up of what their labor market earnings are in this database, so that we can get a sense of how they fare over a 10-year time period, or even longer than 10 years if we so choose. That's just the highlights. I'll get into these details more specifically when I get into the methods. The 3 programs that we're looking at, the first one is a pre-1990 program. The sample frame we're looking at is calendar year 1986, so individuals who had a workers' compensation claim in 1986 that resulted in a permanent impairment. At that time, it was Bill 101 that was in effect. It was called Permanent Disability Program in terms of the benefits and the policy around how benefits and other services were adjudicated. There was a single benefit received at that time. It was based on pre-injury earnings and the percentage of permanent total bodily impairment. So the benefit they received was not associated with how well they fared in the labor market after recovering fully or to whatever degree they recovered. It was based solely on their percentage of total bodily impairment. That was an assessment that was done. At that time, they had in-house books that they used to assess total bodily impairment. Most recently, as some of you may know, they use an American Medical Association guides for rating permanent impairment. It wasn't too different, the process by which it was done. And that determined, as well as your pre-injury earnings, what benefit you would receive. So the program really focused on benefits. There was some provision of vocational rehabilitation services as well at that time. So all permanently impaired individuals received a lifetime benefit, and that benefit was basically the net pre-injury earnings times the percentage of total bodily impairment, and then 90%. So that was considered to be the replacement rate, 90% of that amount. So, and that would be received for life, and it was a certainty, regardless of whether you were in the labor market or not, you would receive that benefit based on that formula. There was obviously caps at the top end and minimum amounts as well that came to play, and other little details that tweaked the amount you received, but that was basically the overall formula at a high level of what benefits they would receive. The second program we're looking at came into existence in 1990. I call it post-1990 program. Some people think of it as a Future Economic Loss and Non-Economic Loss Award, FELNEL. It's an acronym some people use who work in the field. The sample we're looking at is claimants who had an injury happen in 1992. In that program, there was 2 benefits being received. a loss of earnings capacity, which is the FEL, the future economic loss, and a nominal non-economic loss award, which was the NEL. The program focused on labor market reentry, so LMR, and it was highly structured review process. There was a review a first assessment was done at 12 months of continuous time on benefits, another one at 36 months, and another one at 5 years, I believe. And so there was set cut points in which the assessment was reviewed to reassess what the future economic loss was, to see if that person was back at work or not, because that determined what the benefits being received would be. So individuals were assessed as having a loss of earnings capacity received this future economic loss award, which is based on your net pre-injury earnings minus your net post-injury earnings capacity, and times 90%. So the replacement rate here was also 90%, but obviously based on a totally different formula that took into consideration what your current labor market earnings were relative to pre-injury earnings. And as I mentioned, there was a couple of reassessments that happened over 2 time periods up till the 6-year mark, at which time you got locked in till age 65. This benefit was only till 65. It wasn't for life. There was a pension that kicked in after age 65 that was based on certain amount of your benefits that you're receiving and being put aside into a program. And then the third program we're looking at is one that was introduced in 1998. So we actually have a cohort from that first year of the program that we're looking at. It was Bill 99. It's called Loss of Earnings Capacity, or LOE program. Here too there was 2 benefits potentially being received, the LOE, so the loss of earnings capacity benefit, and as well as the NEL is similar to the FEL-NEL the post-1990 program. So labor market reentry was less structured in terms of the assessments weren't at specific periods of time. It could be done at any point in time over a 6-year time period, multiple times as well, depending on what the recovery cycle was of the injured worker. There was increased obligations also of the injury employer and of the parties involved in the injured worker as well, and it was described as being self-reliance. Some of you might know this vocabulary if you work in the system. Wage replacement rates were reduced from 90 to 85% in this program. So individuals, again, who were assessed as having a loss of earnings capacity received a wage replacement award that was based on the same kind of formula as the FEL-NEL program, other than the replacement rate was now 85%. And the intermittent monitoring then over the 6 years before lock-in till age 65. It's a lot. So 3 different programs, quite dramatically different in how they deal with adjudication of benefits in the service provisions. Okay, so just a quick summary of those programs then. Okay, so based on the key characteristics, duration of benefits, one of them was lifetime, the other 2 were till age 65 if you had a loss of earnings capacity that was enduring. Replacement rates were 85%. Other characteristics were the provision of other services that I'm focusing on here, vocational rehabilitation, a structured LMR program, and a less structured LMR program, along with self-reliance.
Is it too early to say that the 2 to the right, the loss of earnings capacity isn't whether they're actually earning or not, but whether they're deemed to be earning?
Earnings. Good point.
Okay.
Good. Yes. So it's an assessment. It's an assessment of what the person, based on the adjudicator's understanding from the evidence they've gathered from the physician and from other sources, what they are capable of earning in the labor market based on their skill set and those kinds of things. So it's not actual earnings, but an earnings capacity assessment. Okay. So the data linkage we created. So this study was made possible by a data linkage that we've done with quite a large. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Okay, longitudinal administrative data bank. It's LAD for short. This is a database that is 20% of the Canadian tax filers. It's resident at Statistics Canada. I've been using this for quite some time for a number of different studies. So a linkage we did of workers' compensation claimants with this database has made this study possible. So with regards to the LAD database, once an individual is selected to be in that database, so one in 5 people are selected into it. They're included every year. They follow that individual right up until they pass away and their estate files a closure of their social insurance number. it follows individuals. It started in 1982, as I mentioned earlier on, and to the most recent tax file. So, you know, if you were there in 1982 and you're still around, you'd be in that database that whole time period. The database tops up each year as well with new tax filers. So, you know, people might immigrate to Canada, you know, children become adults and become working the labor market and have a social insurance number. It gets topped up each year so that even cross-sectionally it's representative of the Canadian tax filing population. And the coverage is really great for working age adults. You know, most people are filing taxes, so we have 98% of coverage for a working age population, which is really great for when we do this linkage, because we can be quite confident that we'll find about 1 in 5 of the claimants that we're trying to link up with this database. So the injured worker sample frames that we are using are coming from the Workers' Compensation Board, the WSIB administrative data file. So we can take all of the claims information that's available in the administrative files and link that up with the LAD database. And I'm using 3 particular years, as I mentioned, 1986, 1992, and 1998. They're each about 6 years apart, is it? Yeah, 6 years apart, and they're from different programs. It was part of another study, I'll admit, looking at 86 and 92, and at the same time we linked up 98, and this allowed us to look at those 3 different programs. So we're taking one calendar year cohort of claimants from each of those programs. Okay, the linkage process. This is a really simplified kind of conceptualization of how the linkage happens. So we have 86, 92, and 98. We take the whole sample frame, so all claimants from that calendar year that had a claim that resulted in ultimately a permanent impairment. Using their social insurance number, we can link it up with the LAD database, which obviously, as I mentioned, has from 1982 to most recent time period. It's 20% simple random sample, so we'd want to find 1 in 5, hopefully, if that our theory holds. And we did actually find 18 to 90% of each of those claimant cohorts, so we're pretty close. You know, for whatever reason, there was about 1 or 2% that we couldn't identify. So this is the linked sample frame by different types of baseline characteristics. So we're looking at 2,500 people in claimants from 1986. A bit larger for 92 and a bit smaller for 1998. Distribution across women and men, different age brackets in the injury year, you know, different impairment levels in the injury year, and different pre-injury earnings in the injury year. The yellow highlights that we have here are just to reflect the largest strata within each of those categories of characteristics, and I'm going to focus a little bit on those yellow substrata in the results section, just because I can't show you all of the data. We actually produced outputs for each of those strata, and I'm just going to focus on the yellow ones and a little bit of the other ones as well, but not everything. But it's available on request. Okay, so we took each of those claimants that we identified in this LAD database and we matched them up with controls, uninjured people who were in that tax file who had very similar characteristics on key parameters that were of interest to us that we thought would be relevant to their labor market earnings particularly, so that we could compare them after the accident year to see how well the claimant fared relative to these matched concurrent controls. So we took the injured claimant, we matched them up to 10 controls. It's a big database. We could choose up to 10 if there was 10 that were good matches. Sometimes it was less than 10. Sometimes it was only 5. But we did the best we can and cut it off at 10. We wouldn't want to choose more than 10. So just so that one claimant doesn't get all the best controls, we also randomized through the process of selecting each of the controls and make sure everybody had a good distribution of matches. The key matching characteristics we were looking at was their earnings in each of the 4 years prior to the accident year. So we were looking at both the level of earnings each year, so to match on similar levels of earnings, and also because we had 4 years, obviously the trajectory of earnings would be matched as well for the injured worker and the uninjured controls. They would have similar earnings levels each year over 4 years prior to the accident year. Sex was an exact match characteristic too, that it had to be men with men, women with women. Age was another matching characteristic. The controls also have to all be residing and working in Ontario, so that we made sure that we're not matching people from Manitoba or British Columbia with claimants that are from Ontario. And then there was also propensity score, and I won't get into too much details about that. That's an approach that you do to determine, based on whatever characteristics you have available, what is the propensity to be a claimant, a workers' compensation claimant with a permanent impairment. And you wanted to have this propensity to be a claimant. Even though the controls obviously weren't workers' compensation claimants, the probability of them being a workers' compensation claimant should be similar to the injured claimant that they're being matched with. And for anybody who wants to know more about that, again, after the presentation, I can get into details about how we went about that. But that just tightened up the match to make sure that maybe if we're missing something in characteristics here, the propensity score might accommodate for all the other stuff that we didn't quite match on exactly. The beauty of doing this concurrent control matching is we're hopefully through doing that, we're controlling for environmental stuff that affects both injured worker and control, so that the environmental factors in 1986 obviously were very different than 92, were very different than 98. But if we're doing a comparison with people who are in the labor market, have similar characteristics at the same time, hopefully the same factors are affecting both those groups, the claimants and the control, so that we can control indirectly for changes that are happening in labor market and opportunities, earnings, other factors that are bearing on success in the labor market. So earnings recovery analysis. So we considered injured workers' yearly labor market earnings. It's a tax file. At the end of the year, you file taxes on what you earn in a particular calendar year. So we're looking at their yearly labor market earnings after their work injury compared to the average of the match control. So, and I described that, the notion of what that construct is as proportion of earnings recovery. Key thing to keep in mind, I'll actually return to the construction of that shortly after I go through a few slides, but that's what we're really looking at, is how well that claimant is doing in terms of labor market earnings relative to their matched concurrent controls. They have up to 10, right? So we take the average of those 10 controls. There might be some noise in the data. One person arbitrarily in the controls might do really well or really poorly. Hopefully when we take 10, it averages out and gives you a sense of what on average that counterfactual scenario would be. If that injured worker had not been injured, they would be just like the controls, and that they would on average be similar to those controls and characteristics if our matching had worked well. And it did. Actually, we did quite a bit of testing of the matching algorithm and results to make sure that the matches were quite solid. So the injured worker earnings trajectories were identified. So I'm looking at, I'm looking at trajectories, not specifically just 1 year, but we're looking at a trajectory of those yearly amounts over a period of 9 years. So we're trying to map out not just what the injured worker does in a particular year or year by year separately, but the pattern of the earnings recovery over a 9-year time period, so that we're really trying to think about what the path is of labor market engagement over a period of time rather than single year engagement activity, trying to explain individual years. And so we're using a statistical modeling technique that clusters earnings recovery trajectories within the claimant groups that we're looking at into groups based on similarity of trajectory. So what we're trying to do is pull out patterns that we see of trajectory. So there might be a group that does really well at the beginning and peters out and does worse subsequently a few years down the road. So if they're all very similar in terms of their trajectories, they'd be clustered together. There might be some people who start off poorly but do better after time. All the ones that have that similar pattern be grouped together. Our statistical modeling dealt with that, and I can, again, to people really interested in the details, can get into that with them afterwards. But it's a statistical technique that looks at these latent characteristics. They're not directly observed, but they're in our data indirectly by these trajectories that we've calculated in terms of their yearly performance in the labor market relative to controls, and clusters them into common patterns within the samples that we have of the 3 different claimant cohorts. Then what we did as a next step, once we identified the baseline sort of different types of clusters of trajectories, we added variables to our modeling that included the program type to see if the program type had a bearing on what type of trajectory you would likely be in. The baseline characteristics of sex, age bracket, impairment bracket, pre-injury earnings bracket, and then also unemployment rate was a continuous variable that changed over time. So those characteristics were added after we did the identification of the different clusters of common trajectories. So we used the model then afterwards. Once we kind of got our modeling all done, we went back and we used the model results to predict the probability of an injured worker being in a particular type of trajectory based on the program they were receiving benefits in, and also based on their baseline characteristics. That's probably a lot. Hopefully it'll gel as we're going through this, and I'll, if it's not, just ask and I'll kind of try to elaborate as much as I can to make sure it makes sense. The primary focus, as I mentioned, is on program types. We want to see how does 1986 vary from 1992, from 1998. And hopefully when we see some differences, as best we can think of them as being associated with the program rather than the cohort, hopefully, because we're controlling for cohort differences across those years based on that comparison with their contemporaneous controls who are also being affected by the same labor market conditions. A secondary focus was just looking at the baseline characteristics of sex, age bracket, impairment bracket, all those characteristics to see how that has a bearing on the probability of being a different type of trajectory. That's a lot, I imagine. No questions? I'm willing to take questions. Going once? Okay. So the two key questions then we're focusing on, and it draws from the previous slide. So how does program type, one of these three programs, affect the probability of being in a particular type of trajectory? Question two is, how do baseline characteristics of an injured worker, so each of these baseline characteristics, affect the probability of being in a particular trajectory? So that's the key things I'm going to look at in my results. So back to, remember saying I was going to talk a little bit more about proportion of earnings recovery. I was concerned that not everybody would realize what that meant, so I'm just going to give a bit more detail, because the programs that we're looking at themselves base benefits on pre-injury earnings, right? Whereas I'm not looking at pre-injury earnings. I'm looking at earnings of the injured worker after their injury compared to contemporaneous control. So the pre-injury earnings isn't being factored into any of this that I'm doing. So the example I have is if an injured worker is earning in 2006, this is obviously after their work injury, maybe from the 1998 cohort, they're making $20,000. If the average of the labor market earnings of their match controls is $50,000, that would be the proportion of earnings recovery, the key outcome that I'm interested in, would be 40% there. And the key difference between this earnings recovery based on controls versus comparing it to a pre-injury earning amount is that earnings of controls obviously vary over the life course. So, a young person who is injured, and even the controls, might be making minimum wage when you first see them in the database, but 10 years down the road, they're into their 30s and they've gotten a better job, some promotions hopefully, and they're making substantially more income. So comparing them with controls, we're going to control for that lifetime sort of changes in labor market earnings that are obviously an important part of the life cycle in the labor market, rather than keeping at a fixed amount that's a pre-injury earnings, which in the example I'm giving of a young person working minimum wage, you wouldn't think of them always only being able to make the minimum wage till they're age 65, right? So whereas the pre-injury earnings would assume that it's a fixed phenomenon. So just to give a bit more insight into how pre-injury versus control counterpart earnings might vary, I've given data from these three cohorts that looks at both. Even though we're not really using pre-injury in the analysis, we did do some statistical kind of calculations to see how that varied. So this is a comparison of our three cohorts. This is 10 years of post-accident earnings, where we're comparing it to 10 years of, say, pre-injury earnings compared to 10 years of control earnings. So this is discounted to the year of accident with a 3% discount rate. I won't get into all the details, but it's comparing a 10-year time period after the work injury, including the injury year of the claimants, compared to the controls relative to, say, assuming that maybe they would have had 10 years of pre-injury earnings during that time period if they weren't injured. So to see how that varies by certain key characteristics. So here we have, this is based on the pre-injury earnings, and this is based on control. This is just giving us our confidence intervals. So for the whole cohort, if we base it on pre-injury earnings, the recovery rates of the claimants is 79%, where it's 69% for the based on this is 1998 cohort, by the way, and 69% based on control earnings. Key divergences that we see are circled in red for the people who are less than 24 or less in the year of accident, because, as I mentioned, minimum wage type stuff. They recover 168% of their pre-injury earnings, but only 91% of their control earnings. For the oldest group, it's the opposite, where the pre-injury earnings are a very high bar because some of these people retire subsequently, not just the claimants, but also their matched controls retire. So based on pre-injury earnings, it would be 69% recovery, so very low recovery relative to the base, and based on control earnings, which is 76%. So keeping that pre-injury earning bar as whatever age you're injured, like at 49 or something, and assuming that they're going to continue to earn that amount for the next 10 years till they're 59, is a higher bar than looking at their control counterpart who are the same age and some of them transitioning into retirement. So that's the main, it's really an age factor that you really see the patterns diverging. Over the whole cohort, there's still quite a bit of difference based on the distribution of people's ages and when they're injured in here too, so we do see a divergence there. Any questions about that? We're good with that? Okay. So, results. So, this is just a summary. I'm going to get into much more detail. So we identified 5 distinct trajectories. I'll be showing them to you shortly. And then for some substrata, we looked at program type, which was significant for some substrata, and baseline characteristics were also significantly different across different cohorts, sub-cohorts, and substrata within the samples as well.
Substrata?
So substrata. So when we're looking at somebody who's in the age bracket of less than 24, whose impairment level, the baseline, a strata because they're defined by more than one baseline characteristic. Okay, sorry. This is a messy thing to look at, but I will try to explain it. Okay, so I mentioned in the previous slide that we identified 5 distinct trajectories. So and you can see them. It's not very clear, unfortunately. So this red line here that I'm following here, that's one of the trajectories. That's the lowest trajectory we identified. These are people. This is proportion of earnings recovery, so 20% and going down. There was a group, a trajectory that lots of people who clustered into one of these trajectories that we described as being trajectory 1, the lowest trajectory.
And that's a quarter of your sample.
And that's a quarter. Well, you're quick. You can see that really well. There you go. Quarter. That's a quarter of the sample. And then there is the second one we call dramatic downward spiral. So that's pointing to this one, which starts off at doing quite well and then goes down, right? And that's this about 13% here. Okay. Then there's this dramatic upward spiral. I'm not sure if that's the best names for them, but I had to give them some names that were distinct. So this is this blue one that starts low at 20%, but goes up to maybe about what is it? We're looking at maybe 50%. So that's this blue one. That's about 20% of the sample. This is called the second highest trajectory. What's in black here. So it starts at 80%, gets better up to 100%, and then goes down a little bit. And then the highest trajectory starts up at 100% and gets even better. So that's that last one. Very small group, about 9%. So those were the baseline clusters of 5 trajectories that we found that were reasonably distinct and were meaningful to look at separately. This is the year after the accident to 9 years after the accident. So 9-year trajectories.
But all 3 cohorts.
And all 3 cohorts are in the data that define these 5 trajectories. Yeah, this is looking at stacking them all together, running the regression modelings that result in these identifying of these clusters of trajectories. and then we're going to parse out, the other characteristics that modify the probability of being in each of these trajectories. This results that we're seeing here already has all of those other variables in it, but I haven't talked about it yet. But they're in there already. That's defined these confidence intervals. The dotted lines around the lines suggest a probability of 95% chance of being within a certain range. So I'm going to talk about these different trajectories. If you don't remember them, and I'm saying trajectory 1 or something like that, remind me and I'll explain which one I'm referring to. Because I've given them numbers and also some names as well, so that I can refer back to them as I give you some more results. Okay, so in the following slides, we're going to just look at the probability of being in each of those 5 trajectories based on different substrata that we've defined, primarily by the impairment bracket. So we're focusing on the 10 to 20% impairment bracket. That was the largest strata in terms of impairment brackets that we had from, less than 5% up till greater than 50%. The largest group was 10 to 20%, which I think was maybe about 50% of the group. I have to look back. Okay. The other largest group in terms of pre-injury earnings was the 20 to 40K. So we're going to focus just on that group as well. So that this substrate of 10 to 20 and 20 to 40K. We're going to look at men and women separately. And we're going to look at each age bracket separately as well. So that we can see how it varies between, men with different, characteristics and women with different characteristics of different ages. This is the group this is men. Men. The 25 to 34 age bracket. Their pre-injury earnings were in the $20,000 to $40,000 range, and their impairment was between 10 to 20%. And we're looking at the probability of being in each of those trajectories, which this is the lowest trajectory, the trajectory 1 that we are looking at, trajectory 2, 3, 4, and 5. And it's also, I'm not sure if you see down below at the bottom, but each of the programs are there as well. The 86 group, the 92 group, and the 98 group. You don't see that from the back as well? Sorry about that. And this is the probability of being in that specific trajectory for this substrate that we're looking at. So the probability of being in the lowest trajectory, which started off at, I think it was about 20% and spiraled downward, and it was a large group overall. But the probability is about maybe 17% for the 86 group. It's about, I'm not sure what that would be, maybe 12% for the 92 group, and it's about, maybe 8% for the 98 group. And those little things that some people call them whiskers that you see with around each of the dots, that gives you the confidence interval for 95%. Sheila already has a question. I couldn't figure that out.
Clarification: the $20,000 to $40,000 pre-injury income is based on what dollars in what year?
Okay, 94. It was from we had constructed some of these variables for another study, and so we left it with that. So 94. One of our cohorts from 92, so that's why when we were looking at that group, we had constructed $94. Okay. So what we can see, I'm not sure if you can see it at all, but particularly with this lowest earnings trajectory, I've circled it for a reason, because the 98 group is statistically very separate from the 86 group, so that it's significantly lower at 95% confidence of being a lower probability. There's an overlap a bit with the 92 group, but it's very distinct from the 86 group. So that a statistically significant lower probability of being in this lowest trajectory. It's a mouthful. Okay, the other 4 trajectories, as you can see, the whiskers part of them, they all overlap with each other. Here there's almost a separation, but not quite, for the second highest trajectory, for this group, this substrata here. So here we almost see a higher probability statistically of being in the second highest trajectory group. And I started off with the age 25 to 34. The group less than 25, there's no difference across those. They're all overlapping. That's why I didn't show it. I do have it available way down in the slide deck after, if you want to see them. Okay, are we good with that? So I'm going to look at another substrata. Okay. Okay, so here we have men. This is a slightly older age group, but the same baseline pre-injury earnings and the same impairment strata. I've just put this in. This is the group that's the largest in the sample. You know, those are the characteristics that I had identified in yellow in the sample characteristics way at the front end of the presentation. So this is the largest group. There's two trajectories here that are circled that are statistically separate, distinct for the 98 relative to 86, and even relative to 92. So the lowest trajectory here is very separate from the other two for the 98 group. So much lower probability of being in the lowest trajectory. And here, statistically significantly different, a higher probability of being in the second highest trajectory for this group relative to the 86 group. Okay, overlap with the 92 group, but distinct from the 86 group. The other three there's a lot of overlap, so we can't really make much of a comment about those. Okay, so we're looking at one more age bracket for men. Yeah, good, thanks. Okay, and so here, this one's significant. As you've seen how much it jumps up for this age bracket, actually, this lowest trajectory for when you're 50 to 59, substantially higher probability of being in this lowest trajectory for all three groups, but still much lower, statistically different and lower for the most recent 98 cohort here. Here, the second highest trajectory also distinct from 86 and 98 are very distinct, and then the highest trajectory also has a higher probability for this group. So a lot of people actually doing quite poorly, but then very distinctly also improvements with the most recent cohort of these high trajectories. Okay, now we're going to look at women. So, women. The lowest trajectory being distinct for women who are 25 to 34. We found the exact same thing for men, 25 to 34. The patterns are not different for women. The levels are, but the patterns of significant differences are not unique here. We're looking at women who are 35 to 49, the lowest one being a lower probability most recently, and the highest one having a higher probability most recently. And then for the oldest age group, we get, again, the three trajectories that are different from in 98 from the 86 group. So summary of findings. Then, so we found 5 distinct trajectories in our data. For most substrata, not all of them, the 98 cohort has significant lower probability of that very low earnings trajectory. One of them we didn't find it, but for the other 3 we did. And if we look at other substrata, different combinations of those characteristics, we tend to see the same thing where there's a significant difference of the lowest and the second highest trajectories for the most recent program. So it endures across different ways of slicing the data. So those two stood out. The trajectory 1, which was that really low one, and trajectory 4, which was that second to highest level. And then, so these two trajectories 2 and 3 were not different across any of the substrata we looked at. So those, number 2 was, I forget what that was, an upward spiral, the downward spiral, and 3 is one of the other ones. Then the oldest age bracket, the 50 to 59, also had another one that stood out, was the probability of being in the highest trajectory for the 98 cohort. So other things we want to think about then in terms of next stages or how we can do a little bit better with these kinds of analyses, we need to consider maybe several years from the newest program. This is really critical. Sheila's nodding her head. The 98 one was the first year of the program. So it may not have transitioned into being fully operational. What we're seeing there might not play out over all the years following it, getting deeper into that program. So it would be nice to look at a larger set of calendar year cohorts from that program, as well as from the other programs as well. So if we look at multi-year cohorts from each of the programs, we can have more precision in terms of our estimates as well. And that's something I would like to do and plan to do. We also might consider other characteristics of the injured workers, maybe looking at their occupation, their industry, nature of injury, part of body that was injured, any kind of characteristics we think would bear on the probability of labor market success following work injury and permanent impairment to get a more precision on the kinds of variables that make a difference in terms of labor market success. And still possibly to continue to focus on program type as well, but also look at a whole other set of characteristics that are meaningful markers of probability of success. Some references for all those wonderful statistical methods. And that's it.